under the influence and the inspiration of Hans Christian Andersen, I will tell you some fairy tales with the idea that underneath them maybe there's some truth. But it's really in that spirit that I would like you to understand what I'm going to talk about. First thing I want to just touch on is communication. Communication is partly what this is about with relationships. And when I talk about communication, it really doesn't matter to me too much what kind. In other words, whether it's communication between teacher and student, or between therapist and client, or between friends, lovers. For me, it's really all the same in some respect. And then there's the question of what do we mean? What gets communicated? And this turns out to be a very tricky issue. And I would say, this is my first fairy tale, that what communication is about is communicating a meaning. But the meaning is not obvious. It's something you have to intuit. Meaning is a complex of what you say, the information, the content, how you say it, how you move, how you use your voice, what you do with your body, the total relationship that you're in now and in the past that accumulates, how aroused you are, how excited. And when you take all of those together, you get sort of what I'll call a meaning Gestalt, sort of a whole meaning which you cannot boil down to any one thing. It is not information. It is the subjective essence of the main thing that you have gotten or given at any one point. I say this because it's so extremely important to distinguish what we mean by meaning compared to information, which would be in pure words or something like that. I looked up meaning in a dictionary, in many dictionaries, in fact. And it's very interesting because, at least in the English dictionaries and the French one that I looked in, what they say that meaning is what you show forth. Doesn't say anything about language, doesn't say anything about information. It's what you manifest. It's what you're aiming at. So that it is something that has to be extracted from the whole message of the communication. Yet that's the unit of communication. So when we talk about communication, we have to talk about how it is subjectively received and what are all the things that go into the intuitive grasp of what somebody means when they talk to you as a teacher or a therapist or whatever. I think this is obvious to everybody, yet it's worth spelling out, because when you spell it out, then you have to go into the different parts of it. So I'm talking about a meaning Gestalt. So what goes into it? What is it made of? Even though, remember, as a Gestalt, it's greater than the sum of its parts. None of these parts alone explains what the meaning Gestalt is. They just are the composants, the elements that make it up. And so it means that I'll have to talk about the relationship, right now and the past, how it accumulates. I'll have to talk about language and the way it's used. I'll have to talk about all the nonverbal things, and tonicity and arousal. And something that I'll get to a little later, which I'll call the dynamic forms of experience. This has to do with how forces get distributed in time, how you stress. What is the sort of like the form of feeling in which something is said. Excuse me. Let's start with the relationship. because it says communication and relationship. Part of whatever the meaning is of the communication depends on the relationship. Perfectly obvious. Let's look at it a little more closely. I think that if I were the medical director of a hospital, and I was like a czar, and I could make any law I wanted, the first law I would make is that if a doctor or a nurse or an attendant or anybody saw a patient and walked into the room with them, or the patient walked into the room with them, if that member of the hospital didn't say hello and look them in their eye, they would be fired on the spot. Because nothing can happen that uses the relationship if you don't start with that. I've been in the hospital enough, as many of us have, to know that when that happens, and it happens a lot, you really feel like a walking organ. And you have no desire to have any interaction with the medical staff. And you will be less cooperative, you will say less, you will go into fewer details, and the entire communication gets changed because they didn't look at you and say hello or introduce themselves. I think this is a general rule, and it's a very important one. The other thing is the power relationship. When I was back teaching in New York, I was teaching at the Cornell Medical School of New York Hospital, which is one of those private institutions that's very, very good, and they get maybe 20 applications for one student. And so they're highly selective and pick really good students. And every year, every now and then, our chairman used to say to us, especially to the new faculty, he'd say, now remember, the students who you're going to be teaching are probably smarter than you are. You couldn't get into this school anymore. Our selection criteria have gone up that much in the last 10 years. So when you are in an interaction with a student, remember, they are as smart or smarter than you. The big difference is that you have certain pieces of knowledge that they don't have yet. If you say that to a teacher, and the student knows you've said it, the relationship becomes very changed. It becomes much more of an equal one. The power still remains in a certain respect, but it's now selected into a certain domain. It's not people power, it's knowledge power, and that's a different ballgame. The other thing is this. This I've seen many times, and it's my own personal experience. I was not a very good student, but I was good in a couple of subjects, and it was always if the teacher was passionate about their subject. That was the only thing that really mattered. If they were passionate and I felt their passion and their engagement as a human being, then I could get drawn in and start to get interested and maybe even study. But without that, forget it. There was no way. And I think this is true once again in almost all relationships. This is my prologue to the whole thing. And this business of how you establish the relationship in the beginning is that usually you state the relationship that you have with the person you're talking to right away. So for instance, if this were a lecture hall and I walked in here cold and said, the earth is flat, it's not round. That would be a piece of knowledge, maybe. And suppose I had said, this morning I'm going to tell you that the earth is flat, it's not round. by just saying, this morning I'm going to tell you, you've situated your relationship with the other person. It's happening now, it's happening here, and I'm going to do this with you. And once again, the tonality of the relationship gets shifted. These are things that we usually don't learn. We know them automatically. Part of it has to do with being polite, but it's also part of our trade, whichever specific of the trades we're into. Here's another thing that goes into the relationship that is extremely important. That is perfection. We all strive for some kind of perfection. We want the class to be a perfect class, or the lecture to be a perfect lecture, the lesson to be perfect, the session to be perfect, all that kind of stuff. It's an illusion. It never happens, and it is a very lucky thing that it doesn't happen. One time, 3 colleagues and I, all of us really very experienced in looking at mother-baby interactions, decided we would pick out who we thought were the best, the most natural mothers of all that we could see. This is during the first year of life. And so we watched tapes and tapes and tapes, and we came up with, a handful. Is that me? Oh, that's me. My son programs these things, so I never know what's going to come out of it. Okay. So we got these babies, and we picked the very best mothers, clinically speaking, and there was a lot of agreement. And then we watched the tapes. And when it came to the mothers doing exactly the right thing at the right moment, which means matching the baby's intensity or the stimulus level that the baby is ready to receive, or the novelty in the game, etc., etc., we found that most of these mothers made at least a small error every 19 seconds. These are the best mothers we could find. When we looked at it more closely, we realized that, in fact, most of the teaching occurred because of the errors. That as soon as there was a rupture in the perfect contact between the mother and the baby, or a derailment, the mother and the baby would then together have to repair it. And that's where the baby really learns how to be with another person, how to negotiate with them, and how to put the world back together, because it's always going to go off track. Now, this is true in not only being a mother, but in being a teacher. There will always be misunderstandings, lack of clarifications, small pieces that weren't gotten, and they become the points around which the real learning occurs. So, messing up is not the tragedy. The tragedy would be being perfect, because then you'd learn nothing. And so this becomes a very important lesson with this whole business of the relationship and how it gets put together. It's very important to stress that to repair a slight error or dysregulation requires 2 people. It's a co-creation, the repair. It's not just one person. Because you can't correct it unless you know what it was that went wrong for the other person as well as for yourself. And so they both have to get involved in this kind of a thing. So let me now move on to the to other aspects of the relationship. We talk a lot. Excuse me, could I get a glass of water? Yeah, can do. Thank you. We talk a lot about what constitutes the best environment in which to work, teach or do therapy or whatever. And there's no question that there is something that we can call an enabling environment. There has to be some kind of structure that permits the context in which learning will occur. In psychotherapy, we talk an awful lot about the holding environment. Thank you. We talk about the holding environment, which is, it's one of those loose terms. It really means the nature of the relationship between the people such that there is something supportive about the ability to learn, and there is an openness to it, and you're not forcing anybody to do anything. You're creating a situation whereby they can do it themselves for the most part. This holding environment is absolutely vital. There have been now, I don't know, hundreds of studies about psychotherapy in most of the Western countries to see which types of psychotherapy work the best, whether it's psychodynamic or behavioral or drugs or whatever. It turns out that there's only one factor that accounts for most of the success, and that's the therapeutic relationship. It's not the approach, it is not the technique, it is not the nature of the medicines you give. It is the nature of the therapeutic relationship that gets established, and I would say that that's the same thing for the majority of learning situations. It can be the relationship established between the teacher and the student. So this business of trying to open out, unpack, as we say, the nature of the relationship becomes absolutely crucial. It's the strongest thing we as professionals have going for us. Not any one thing is more strong. I think a word here about attachment is important in both therapy and teaching. I know that you're all familiar with the theories of attachment, more or less, and I think that what happens in these situations is that the students and the clients ideally establish some kind of attachment relationship with the teacher or therapist. It's not their primary attachment figure, but it carries some of the color and associative meaning of it. And it becomes a very crucial aspect of the whole thing. And it's something you try not to disturb. In fact, you try to create it. You know, it can get abused, in which case you got to look out. But for the most part, it's something that we do need to have. Most animal societies that are social require a degree of attachment between the members for anything to happen. Otherwise, nothing happens. So that we're talking about part of the basic aspects of being in a relationship in order to communicate. We move on now to language, because that's a big part of the communication. We're going to talk about 4 different levels of communicating with language. The first is the one that we think is so important, namely the verbal content of what we say. This is much less important than we think, but it's essential. I'm not knocking it. You got to get some information that's explicit and declarative across to people at certain times. At other times you don't have to, but we'll get to that. I make the distinction here between what I'll later talk about as implicit knowledge versus explicit knowledge. I'm talking now about explicit knowledge. In other words, that part that's verbal, symbolic, declarative, that you can say or write. That's the explicit part. That's one level of language. The next level is what I call what gets stressed in a sentence. Talking about talking more than reading. And here you have to rely not on what's said, but on the prosody, the music, what gets said. Where does the pitch go up? Where does the voice get louder? Where is the stress placed? You know, when a mother teaches a baby to talk and to learn words, they do something very particular. So that if this is a black truck right here, and the mother that day, as every day, wants to teach the kid something because he's 18 months old and they start to learn language like a sponge. And so she'll jump on any opportunity where the relationship is right, locally and in the large sense of the word. So there'll be a black truck and the kid is playing with the black truck. She said, "Oh, that's a black truck." She says, "Oh, that's a truck." Now, truck. Her voice goes up, she speaks louder, and it has a melodic line that's very different. And so then she essentially throws a piece of magic at the word truck or at the sound truck. And then the kid is much more involved in that sound, and he knows that the sound is somehow rather connected to this truck. Now, it's an interesting connection because what really is happening is that she and the child start to create a secret world which has to do with, like, they're the only two people, from the baby's point of view, they're the only two people in the world who know that this funny sound, T-R-U-C-K, is connected to this object over here. So now they share something, an intersubjective piece of knowledge that's private. And this kid still doesn't know what truck means. He just knows it refers to this shared piece of magic that popped up from the world when she said, "Oh, that's a truck." Okay, so then the kid says something like, "Truck." She says, "Yeah, that's right, it's a truck." He says, "Truck. Truck, that's right," and they go on like this until the baby's got it and says truck. Now everybody's very happy, baby feels reinforced. Now she goes ahead and he continues to play with it. And she says, "Yeah, that's a black truck." Now she's teaching black. So she extends from the same base by throwing the musicality of her voice on the object. So that in fact, the meaning in the literal explicit sense of black or truck doesn't even appear in the beginning. What appears is the special relationship between the two of them concerning what constitutes magic, passion, excitement, arousal, and whatnot. So this is what happens, I think, in all situations about it. Because you don't have to use baby talk to stress something. You can use regular talk, but there are shifts in the stresses and in the vocal frequency and in the timbre of the vocal cords when you want to get to something important. So this business of prosody is very important. It keeps you sort of awake to the important parts of the explicit message. Then there's another thing, and that's the simple rhythm of talking. When you talk, as I'm talking to you, I establish a general rhythm, which is my own personal rhythm for talking, which is unique, plus or minus, to me. And what happens is when you're exposed to an external rhythm, such as the rhythm in which I speak, what it does is it organizes your nervous system. Rhythm is one of the most powerful organizers of our nervous activity. This is why it's always been used in almost all cultures, whether it's in the form of singing, dancing, drum beats, chanting, whatever. And it organizes into ebbs and flows and clumps whatever mental activity is going on within you as well as your physical activity. So the sheer rhythm of my speech becomes part of our relationship. where I'm influencing you and your brain and your body and your mind, all of those. Then there's a fourth level. The fourth level I would call just sound. I'm one of these people who, when I work alone, like to have the radio on, and I don't listen to it. And it doesn't matter what they're saying, but I feel more attached to the world and less alone when I hear the sound of a human voice, regardless of what it's doing. And when it goes silent, I start to pay attention to other things and I can't concentrate on my work. Now, everybody has a slightly different relationship to this, but what I'm saying is this is yet a whole nother level of how just even the sound of the human voice constitutes part of the relationship that you're in at the moment you're doing something else like learning or writing or reading or whatever. So language starts to get very complicated when you look at these, at least these first four levels. I haven't exhausted them yet. I'd like to talk now about talking, since that's what we do in all of this. So the question is, well, what really is talking? Especially since what you're trying to do is create meaning units. Now, if you're not reading a lecture or reciting from a book, and you're just spontaneously talking, which I'm doing more or less now. I mean, I know roughly where I'm going, but I don't really know exactly. But if you talk like that, which is all intimate talking, and most classroom talking, and almost all therapeutic talking, there's no script. This is unscripted talking. When you do that, you don't know what you're going to say next. And you certainly don't know what you're going to hear next. This is the strangest business, because we act and we think as if we know what's in our mind and we just have to put it into words and it comes out, and there's a faithfulness between something in the mind and what we actually say. It is not true. There is very little faithfulness, because what really happens is this. You have an idea in your mind that you want to say something. And the idea is not in verbal form, unless you've said it so many times that it is in verbal form. But if it's something that's a variation or slightly new or completely novel to you, it is not in verbal form. It's in the idea of concepts which in fact consist of a variety of different images and movements and pictures and flows and stuff like that, but it's not in words. So what you do is, you know roughly what you want to say, and then you sort of choose pieces of your language repertoire, pieces of language that you think can communicate that to somebody else. And you pick out some of them, and then you start to put them together, you assemble them in order to capture the concept behind them. And most of the time, you find that the exact pieces of language that you're trying to put together don't work that well, and so you reject some of them and you put some new pieces of language in there. And then finally you get close enough so that you're ready to spit it out of your mouth. And as you're about to get it out of your mouth into verbal form, you realize that parts of it are okay and parts of it are not okay. But luckily with language you can stutter and stammer and go, well, no, I didn't really mean that. What I meant was something like, no, not exactly but something like, it's unbelievably messy. It is an extraordinarily messy problem when you're trying to express what you really feel. And you're using this whole language stuff that you've got in order to put it all together. Once it's really out there in the public, and you've said it, then it's harder to pull back in and re-say it because it's been said. Now, if, as a teacher, you have already narrated these paragraphs of a lesson enough times that you don't go through this process of what I'll call the unfolding of the intention. Because what you're really doing in this hit and miss fashion is you're unfolding the intention to say something which was in your mind, that you are essentially having them read a book, which is your speech. It's not like you're talking to anybody. You could be a robot, or they could read you, and it becomes very uninteresting. One of the beautiful things about spontaneous speaking, even if it's from notes that you have, or a written form, which you always vary from, is that the audience feels your struggle to get it across so that some kind of meaning becomes graspable by them, even though it's a Gestalt and they don't exactly know what the meaning is. They have a pretty good idea. So this business of the sloppiness of talking is extremely important for maintaining the relationship, the sense that you, the talker, are alive, that you're actually there, that your mind is involved in it, and you might even have some passion about it. Without this effortfulness of unfolding your internal intentions into words, you don't get any of that. So this becomes a vital part of it. It also means that you have to accept that your speech is not accurate completely. It's certainly not perfect. It takes a lot of silly shortcuts and some long cuts, and it does a lot of weird things, but it doesn't really matter. Because it isn't the declarative, explicit meaning that you want to get across. It's a gestalt of what it is you meant to be able to say, even though you can't say it exactly the way you might have meant it. I used to play a sort of mean trick in Geneva. After I got there for the first 5 or so years, I had to teach in French, and my French wasn't very good then. Not that it's great now, but anyway, it's functional. And so I would say to the students, these were students in psychology, and most of them wanted to be clinicians. And I would say, at the very beginning, I said, you're very, very lucky to have a professor who speaks French so badly. The reason is that what you really have to learn in this school is how to figure out what other people mean, not what they say. So I'm going to make all kinds of mistakes, and it will help you to try to work harder on understanding the meaning behind what somebody's trying to get across to you. And they would all go, like this. They didn't buy it too much. But I said, but you know, when I step out of this classroom, I speak perfect French. I said, I'm doing this to be helpful. Total lie. But anyway, they knew it. I'll get back to this point again because it keeps on coming up. When I'm talking about the intention or the meaning unfolding process as somebody talks, I'm talking about an inherent messiness in the way the human mind works. Unless, as I say, it's already been out there and corrected and narrated and put into a more solid form. Even here, you know, if the teacher, let's say, makes a mistake, it's probably a useful learning exercise to really knock home the point. Because then they can go back and talk about the mistake and maybe even why it was made, which would deepen the understanding of what the whole thing is about. So this applies in a lot of different ways. As you probably know, one of the major scientific paradigms that's been shifted in the last 20, 30 years, or even a little more, is that we no longer think of the world as being too orderly. We recognize that most things that happen in the human and natural universe are not continuous, they're not linear, and they're not causal. Or they are for only short stretches. The rest of the time you have certain kinds of chaos or complexity that doesn't permit for what we were all classically taught to think of as linear, causal progression of things. When you think about this, well, to me anyway, it first came as a real shocker. I felt like they'd taken away my solid ground. But the more I've been acquainted with it, the more comfortable I feel with it. The basic idea is this, and that is that at any one moment, either for the weather or for the human mind, where there are so many variables operating at each instant, there is no way that you can account for all of them. That these are, that's not me. That there's an interdependence and sometimes a dependence of one variable on the next. And what they do is these variables sort of just interact and this auto-organize in some respect. And then all of a sudden, unpredictably, there is what they call an emergent property. Something pops up that wasn't there before that can change the whole system. And this is what is meant by discontinuous, non-logical, non-linear leaps in the way things happen. When we look at development now, we realize that we have no idea why the baby changes when they do. When we look at psychotherapy, nobody knows why you change from one day to the next. What part went into it? How much of it was what was said, interpretations, just being with the relationship? No knowledge. We act as if the world ought to be progressive and linear, but it isn't. And so we have to live with these pop-ups, these emergences of unexpected things. And this is why I can say to you with full confidence, you do not know what you're going to say in your next sentence. Because the unfolding of an intention into words is another relatively complex, chaotic process whereby you have a general idea. It isn't that you don't, you do. But you really do not know what the exact form of it will be, and you don't know when it'll happen. It's a fascinating experiment in music on this that intrigues me because it's a different view on prediction. Let me put it another way. If you do a psychotherapeutic session, or if you do a classroom exercise, and if you then look at what happened after the classroom discussion or something like that, at the end of the session, you see certain kind of orderliness, or you can put it into a narrative form about what happened. If you don't do that, if you act as if you are in the middle of the session or in the middle of the classroom exercise, you do not know what's going to happen next. You are riding the crest of the present moment, which hasn't yet arrived on the shore. You don't know where it's going. You have a vague idea, but it's not a real prediction. The musicians have a way of talking about this. They talk about, if I make up a 7-note melody and I play the first 4 notes for you, And then I say, well, now what are the next 3 notes going to be like? The majority of you will pick 2, 3 maybe patterns of how it can end, the last 3 notes. And there's consistency. They say, well, you can't make a prediction. All you can do is say that the first 4 notes had an implication, which limits the possibilities, but you don't know exactly which ones are going to happen. What's curious about this is if you take a bunch of Chinese listeners who don't know Western music, and you play them the same 4 notes of a Western piece of music, and you say, how will it end? They'll give you roughly the same implications that the Western audience, the Western listeners would. And if you do the experiment in reverse, and you play Chinese music, which is different tonally from Western music, to Western listeners, they can draw the implications, which will be roughly the same that the Chinese do, but none of them can predict, except if you're a trained musician from either side. Then you can predict better across the languages. So we're dealing with a world where it looks predictable, but in fact it's not predictable. So if you ask a kid a question, unless they've given you the same answer all year long, like I don't know, you don't know what they're going to say. And so you can't gear up for an answer to their answer unless you're working on your theory of how it goes. This happens a lot in psychotherapy, where you find that you're really talking to and predicting on the basis of what your psychological theories are, not on the basis of who the person is at that moment. And this gets to be dreadfully boring, because they all sound the same. People are much more interesting than our theories, in fact, is what it turns out. Okay, I'll come back to this messiness in the human world again. Let me talk now about another feature that goes into communication that we tend to overlook, especially if you're a psychotherapist of any kind, except for movement, dance, and music therapists. I leave them aside. It's a fascinating thing. I don't know if I'll have time to go into it. I don't know if it's of interest here, but I'm talking about regular talking therapies and most teaching, which is not showing people what to do like you do in gym a lot of the time. Here, I want to make a case that the most primary thing for all animate organisms and for human beings is not the word or the language, it's movement. Movement is the first thing that comes into place. It is the beginning of everything else, and it is the primacy of movement that we should pay much more attention to. Don't forget that in order to talk, you have to move. Your vocal cords are moving, your tongue, your mouth, your palate, your head, your body, your arms are moving. You are like an instrument, you are like a violin or a drum or something like that. Physical effort in the form of motion, force that gets applied over time, has to be put into action in order for the whole verbal line to come into place, and yet we forget that. We act as if the words are coming pure from the oven, or wherever they come from. Let me say something more about movement. Many thinkers, biologists in large part, say, hey, wait a minute. If you look at evolution, first thing that comes into play is the ability to move, like an amoeba or any of these simple organisms. And they do it without any cortex. You don't need to think to move, you just have to move. What you next see in evolution is movement in general starts to go in two directions. One is approach and the other is withdrawal. With more evolution and more motor capacity, it goes in the direction of flight or fight. With more evolution, the emotions, the discrete emotions, like Darwin said, happiness, sadness, disgust, anger, evolve from approach, withdrawal, fight, and flight. These are new evolutionary additions on the basic theme of movement. We're still moving here. Expressions or facial movements, remember. Finally, you get, or next to finally, let's put it that way, you get concepts, ideas. And ideas are mental movements. That's the way they're experienced. It's not just the body that moves. Subjectively, the mind moves. Brentano, the philosopher, says to us, well, wait a minute. If I say to you, think of the moon, what you will do is you will reach for an image of the moon, which you'll then see. Now, what is this business of reaching for an image? How does the mind reach? What the mind does is there is a mental motion, a virtual motion in the mind that occurs in order to accomplish some kind of mental task. And in fact, if you took a brain image with the new techniques, you could see, in fact, that parts of the motor system get involved in the act of reaching for the moon. Reaching means extending towards. That's what the word comes from. So even here we have movement at the basis of that. And finally, we have movement as the basis for so many of our verbal, linguistic constructions and ideas that are actually based on the body. They're not based on abstract thought. And this becomes really important because it changes how you watch the way people talk and what they say. Excuse me. Johnson and Lakoff, this is a cognitive psychologist and a linguist, they've been working on this for more than 10 years, and many people do now, and that is they talk about body concepts or kinesthetic concepts that underlie our language, and they are enormous. They say that what happens is you learn to create body schemas or concepts, and then they act as the base upon which you can construct your language concepts. So, any baby who's a year old is either crawling or walking. So 50,000 times a day, they get off the floor and start to walk somewhere. They start up and they go forward to a point, and then they stop, and then they turn, and then they walk to the right or they walk to the left. This is a body schema of what movement is like, okay? Now, this baby, 20 years later, he's in a discussion with his friend who saw his girlfriend for the first time after a month, and it was an important meeting, and his friend says to him, well, I saw so-and-so, and our baby grown up says, well, what happened? And his friend says, I don't know, our relationship, it started out okay, and we went along for a while, and then we stopped. We got pretty far. Where is far? We got pretty far, and then we stopped. And then, I don't know, it's like we just took different paths. Now, you don't really need to understand a whole lot of language because the basic construct of starting, going somewhere, stopping, and moving in another direction is so much part of our body experience that you just hang the language on this stuff. There are thousands of these, what are called primary metaphors. There's another philosopher who talks about our use of things like inside, outside, in, out, up, down, before, after, all of which the body knows. And we act as if this is pure language. It is not pure language. It is language that has been constructed from what is known from the body. I could go on with these examples. Here's another cute one there about up. The word up. It says, how come you can say things like, oh, well, the stock market went up, or prices went down. And he says it's simple. When you're little, especially, if something's really big, you've got to raise your eyes or your head up to see it. And when it gets littler, you bring your head down. So even simple things you don't even think about, like up and down, are in the body. And you put it into words, and we all know what everybody means. I'm awfully sorry. I guess I got to cover this thing. Anyway. Now, there's another way that we know what the other person means, what their unit of meaning is, which has to do with the mirror neurons. I'm not going to enter into that because Stein is going to talk about it much more extensively. In one word, it's what permits you to intuitively and simultaneously share what another person is sharing. I leave the rest to you, Stein, on that. But it's important. The other thing related to these body concepts has to do with imagining, and the way imagining is used in both teaching and therapy. Turns out that because of the evolutionary organization of movement, one of the first centers that gets laid down is the sensory motor cortex of the cortical stuff. And as emotions get built, they use the sensory motor cortex and integrate with it to make emotions. As concepts like body concepts or mental concepts evolve, they also build through the sensory motor cortex to do that, and the same with language. In other words, all of it gets organized through movement and sensation, but mostly movement. This is why, if you imagine something, like imagine squeezing your hand like that, you imagine it, you do it, and you don't do it, I'm sorry, you just imagine it. Your motor cortex, the same muscles that would fire if you really do it, get triggered and activated, and you can see it on brain images even when you just imagine it. If I say to you, well, in your house, how do you get from the bedroom to the kitchen? What you'll do is you will, in your mind, walk through the house so that you can describe exactly. And as you do that, you can see virtually, no, you can really see it in the brain. The different motor patterns get fired as your legs move, as you turn your body, as all of these things happen. So you are virtually experiencing the thing while you are doing it. You can't get out of your movements. It is at the base of so many things. It's why sports therapy works so well by imagining an action like a golf swing or a tennis stroke, or whereby if you have a TV picture of yourself doing it, you can learn all kinds of things, because what you'll automatically do is make some kind of either mirror neuron story, which is complicated, or some other imitative process where you get a virtual activation of your own motor system. It's like you're doing it, and you can learn from that experience. You don't have to do it. This business of imagining is very powerful. It gets used more and more in different therapies and in different learning situations. For instance, if I'm standing here and somebody says to me, now imagine, don't do it, but imagine you're about to take a step forward. So now I'm imagining taking a step forward. And they, from behind me, just gives me a little shove. I'll fall forward and have to stop myself. If they ask me to imagine the same thing and they give me a push backwards, I won't fall backwards. I won't even move. My body will be primed to resist going in that direction because it's getting ready to go in the other direction. We can see from both the muscle activity and the brain activity that there is activation going on, but it is unconscious and it is non-visible in all these situations. Now, this business of intuitive, all of this evolutionary stuff, of why I said in the beginning, meaning is intuitively grasped as a whole. It is not the verbal content or anything like that. There's the way the brain really works in certain situations, like you're walking in the woods and you see a wild bear. I don't know if there are any bears here. It's frightening to see a bear because you know they can really do you in. Anyway, you see a bear. Now the first thing that happens, neuro-wise, is the sight of the bear hits the retina, comes in through the retina, and it does not go to the visual cortex. It goes right down to the brain stem, which is what arouses you, and I'll talk about that later. And there is an arousal jag, because the brain stem also can perceive, but darkly, so to speak. The arousal system then sends a signal back to the eye and to the visual cortex so that you see the bear. You didn't see the bear at first. The signal just went down to activate you. Now you see the bear as a visual thing, and you immediately, or even before you see the bear, it goes to your motor system, which puts you into a flight pattern, and you turn around and you start to run. After about 2 steps, you see the bear. You haven't seen it yet. You have not seen it. After 2 more steps, it gets up to the cortex and you say, my God, that's a bear. Now, if you had to wait around until you cognitively, linguistically knew that it was a bear, you'd be dead. You need those 4 extra steps to be able to get away. Now, this is what I mean when I'm talking about the meaning of a signal is an intuitive grasp of the entirety of it, of all of the things that have to do with what's going on. It's extremely complicated, and the verbal flow is not what the main part of the story is about. It's an important part of the story. I will not say more about the arousal system till a little later. Let me say one more thing before our break about how to heighten attention and perception, which is something we all want to do in either therapy or teaching. How do you get somebody to really make something light up for them? Turns out that this is what happens. You see something. I see the flowers. I'm not overly excited. by seeing the flowers. They're pretty, but, you know, I'm into other things right now. If there was a relationship between me and the flowers, because somebody special had given them to me and brought them to me, and then it had a little past history, because after appreciating that, I put them in the vase over there. They would start to have relational valence to me. And if the valence was positive, I would feel an emotion towards the flowers, even small. I'd feel happy seeing them, or something like that. Now it turns out that I have the perception of the flowers, it's in my visual cortex. There is two ways to heighten the perception, so it becomes like lit up. One is to feed into the perception an emotional signal from the emotional part of the brain, and the other is to feed into the signal an arousal jag, because it has meaning and triggers into all other kinds of things, and there's a relationship. Now, if you can add emotion and arousal to the perception, then the flowers light up. So this is why the black chalk works. This is why if you make mistakes and then can color the reparation, this is why so many of these things that we do require the human era as accepted and utilized in some way, as well as the sloppiness of being a human being. You know, if we weren't sloppy, we'd be robots. I mean, the beauty of being human has to do with this kind of messiness, so that you can feel where the other person is coming from. Where the other person is coming from is what their meaning intention was. Because it's not going to reside in any one of these things. It's going to reside in this Gestalt of the whole thing. The next thing I wanted to say about communication relationship has to do with certainly in therapy and to some extent in teaching, there's an axiom, and that is you should always try to work in the here and the now, to stay in the present in the here and now. And so the question arises, well, when is now and where is here? Sort of basic questions. Let me start with when is now. Now is a very tricky concept. It has to do with what do we mean by the present moment. We put a good deal of thought into this, as have philosophers for forever. It's not easy. It turns out the present moment is largely a very short period of time. It's the time when you are directly in the experience, the brute experience of something. It seems to last anywhere from 1 to 10 seconds. That's all. And the average is only like 3 or 4 seconds. If you listen to me talk right now, that's 3 seconds. That's a phrase. Most phrases take 3, 4, 5 seconds, not much longer. If I were to read a line of poetry, it would take 2 to 8 seconds. Your average melodic line in music is about that long. A movie shot in a film that's the frames grouped into one thing. It takes, well, it could be the whole picture, but the average is around 4 or 5 seconds. It seems to be the unit where we take a lot of perceptual information, hundreds of pieces, and group it into a Gestalt, which is our meaning unit. So you don't listen to the phonemes as I talk. You don't even listen to the words. You listen to the phrase that carries the meaning package. So that's how long it is. The other thing that's important to know is that it has to do with this difference between objective time and subjective time. The ancient Greeks gave us the word chronos, which is really physical time or cosmic time. It's what we use in psychology and all the natural sciences. It's time that just moves along evenly forever. It eats up the future as it goes, and it leaves the past in its wake. And it's really a thin slice. It's the instant that's passing. Subjectively, that's no good, because what it really says is that the now, the present moment, is so thin, nothing could happen in the present. As soon as it happens, it's already in the past, which is not what our experience is. And a lot of the philosophers have tried to open up this present instant, and Husserl was probably the most successful. And he said, wait a minute, there is such a thing as the present. And the present has an extension, which is like 2, 3, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, in which, as the present instant moves, if it's right here, it carries with it the immediate past of several seconds, which is still ringing in your ear, so to speak. It's not like you have to retrieve it from memory, it's still there. He called it the tail of the meteor, which was retention. And then there was the part where you make the implications of what will happen for the immediate future, which was the protension. So you have this 3 tripartite present moment of the retention, the instant, and the protension of the future. And what we experience during the present is it's like the present instant is like the crest of a wave, and it moves from the horizon of the past to the horizon of the present, and the whole trip takes 5 seconds, let's say. And that is our unit of consciousness. Now, of course, you go from one present moment to the other. So it starts to get complicated because you have this sequences and this nesting of past into it. But that's really what we're talking about. Now, the other thing is the Greeks had another notion which they called kairos. Kairos is the opportune moment. It's the moment of opportunity. It's when a whole bunch of things sort of fall together. They just happen. You don't have control over most of them. Like the events in the world, or the people around you, or where you find yourself. And at that particular moment, if you act, you can change your destiny. And so that's also called a moment of opportunity. But if you don't act during the window of kairos, your destiny will change anyway because you didn't act. So you're kind of stuck. Now, it turns out that every moment we live is a small moment of kairos, because what we do in the present moment will play a role in what's going to immediately happen next, because we are not so linear and we don't know exactly what it'll be, but it'll have implications for the next thing that happens. I was thinking about, well, this gets very obvious in psychotherapeutic sessions, whereby you have to treat moments as fairly open, where anything can happen, and you don't know what'll happen. In the teaching situation, I wonder how you handle it. And I'm not clear, because I've been teaching too much to fairly large classrooms, where it's very hard to establish one-to-one contact, but there certainly are moments when you're in contact with the whole room. And there I rely mostly on my own mistakes, not on things that I see happening, as moments that I take advantage of, as well as noise. But I do it now. I don't wait to do it afterwards. It's very important to stay in the here and now. So, let me say another thing about this moment. We have a group called the Boston Change Process Study Group, where we've been looking at change in psychotherapy. What are the actual moments of change? We look very small. And what we have described is something curious. It's like where you're going along, and then all of a sudden something happens you didn't expect. Sometimes it's very big, sometimes it's very little. But what happens sort of perturbs the status quo. It is a potential opportunity or danger for whatever the working relationship was at that time, or even for the theory of the framework that you're supposed to maintain in that setting. And we call these moments now moments. It's like a moment of kairos, and you don't know what to do. For instance, there's a patient who's lying on the couch in a psychoanalysis, and after 2 years she says, "You know, I wonder what you're doing back there." This is a case of a colleague of mine, and the therapist, a woman, doesn't say much. The patient says, I'm going to sit up and look at you. This is a very timid person. All of a sudden she sits up, she turns around, she looks at the therapist who's sitting there. Now the two women are looking at each other. Neither of them knows what to say. What happens in one of these moments is the level of anxiety in the therapist goes way up, because there's nowhere in any books on technique that tells you how do you respond to this. And they couldn't be. Now, you could hide from a present moment, from a now moment, and most of us do out of cowardice, stupidity, a whole variety of protective techniques. You could say something stupid to the patient who's looking at you as you look at them for the first time in 2 years. You could say, what are you thinking? Truly stupid comment. Or something that sounds more sensible, but it's equally stupid, like, do you see what you expected to see? It's a legitimate question. But all of them are sort of there to protect you and to maintain the position as it was. The power, the therapist inquiring into their mind and all that stuff. Well, this therapist, Lynn Hofer, realized that this was an important moment and did not want to hide behind therapy, but she didn't know what to do and she was anxious. So what she did was, they're looking at each other, she all of a sudden moved her head a little bit forward towards the patient, and she softened her face, and her eyebrows went up a little bit, and she went into a slight smile, and she said, "Hello." Okay? Then the two women look at each other for another few seconds, fairly intensely, at which point the patient then goes back and lies back down, and the therapy is drastically altered. The feeling in the room is different. The therapeutic relationship gets much better and different. The patient starts to talk about different material that she'd never talked about before. And the two of them simply did not talk about what had happened. Now, we would call hello a moment of meeting. It is the moment in which the now moment gets resolved, or kicks the system into a higher orbit of intersubjectivity. The field gets shifted. This brings up the next subject, which I won't get to for a minute, which has to do with implicit knowing about things, because this was never made explicit. They did not talk about it. And one of my colleagues, many of my colleagues have said to me, well, why didn't the therapist say, after this hello had happened and did all of its good work, why didn't they say, well, you know, something important just happened between us in that minute, maybe we should talk about it? Reasonable question. My response to that is, if a boy goes up to a girl and at that point in the relationship says, I love you, and the girl says, it's interesting you say that to me now. If he's smart, he'll run away. Because what she did was she jumped out of the present, the here and now, took a step backwards, and commented on the situation. And I feel if the therapist had said something important happened between us now, the therapist would have been reestablishing the old power thing and the way of looking into her mind, whereas in fact, hello was sufficient. It did its job. You don't fix something that's broken. Now it's true, hello is not an interpretation which you're supposed to be making, a verbal thing. But it turns out it didn't matter because you don't have to do that so much of the time. What you have to do is establish some way to meet through movement, emotion, other things that allow you to blow open the nature of the relationship to a slightly higher level. And it doesn't have to get talked about, although sometimes it can, and sometimes it's very useful to do so, but not always. No, so this is, but these are moments of kairos, the now moment and the moment of meeting. They're the now. So where is the here of the here and now? Now this gets tricky. We talk about the local level. What we mean by the local level is the things that happen between people that occur very rapidly, that take seconds, like our present moment. They are the things that, in fact, make up the building blocks of a relationship or of a communication. They are things like a phrase, verbally, or a gesture like that, or changing your position so that you go like this, or any of these things. Each of these is at what we would call the local level. They are largely movement issues, as we've talked about. Now, in this business of movement, in the here, our point is that we talk a lot about the abstract relationship. We talk about interpreting it, explaining it, doing all kinds of things with it. And from my way of thinking, all of those abstract statements about it are abstract. They are not where life gets lived. Where life gets lived through is at this local level. Many therapists say, well, wait a minute, you're always talking about behavior and movement and all this kind of stuff. That's the superficial level. There's a meaning level behind it, which is the deep level. And my response is, no, you got it upside down. The deep level is what happens from second to second, and the abstract, derived level is how you abstract it and how you tell about it and how you narrate it and how you explain it, which is far from the reality of what really happened. So let's turn things back upside down to talk about where the reality takes place. I think I'm going to jump now, because of time, to talk about forms, the dynamic forms of experience which happen at the here level. What do I mean by dynamic forms? Because we haven't talked about that yet. Albert Einstein was once asked, do you think in pictures or images, or do you think in words? And he said, neither. I think in terms of volumes and forces moving in time and space. Okay? He's talking about movement and force. Now, suppose that's at the very biggest level. Let's zoom in to what I call the local level and talk about the 3 to 5 seconds in which something happens. We have the ability to experience in each of these moments the force of a movement, either physical or mental or both, as it occurs over that journey of 3-5 seconds. Now, let me give you an idea of what I mean. Now, I'm talking about mental movement, like think of the moon, as well as a physical movement. Here are a bunch of adverbs, mostly. These are all what I would call dynamic forms of experience. Exploding, swelling, drawn out, forceful, cresting, rushing, fluttering, tense, gliding, holding still, relaxing, surging, bursting, disappearing, powerful, pulsing. I could go on. I could go on for pages. This is how something gets done. This is what really goes on at the local level. This is part of what I've been talking about when I'm talking about the unfolding of an intention. What is the form in which the effort to get the words and the concepts together is about? It has a feel to it, and we subjectively apply a force to it. In all of these things, there is an implied force. So for instance, if we talk about exploding, well, something's got to make it explode. There's a push or a pull or an engine somewhere. Swelling, something is building up. Now, think of something like a rush, you know. This happens in any kind of activity. You can talk about a rush of emotion. You can talk about a rush of thoughts. You can talk about a rush of movements. It's not specific to any one activity, and it's not specific to any one modality. You can have a rush of visual sensations, a rush of sounds. So that this is some kind of overall reality about the way humans are in life if they are alive. This is a signal of your being vital. Hold in mind now that what I was talking about in the very beginning was if you don't have passion about what you're talking about, you're not going to be an effective teacher or an effective therapist in some regards. This is where part of the passion comes in. It has to do with the form of feeling, what I call the vitality dynamics of expressing yourself. It occurs, as I say, in all activities. It is metamodal in the sense that it doesn't matter whether you're talking about sound, vision, touch. You can have rushes or explosions or drawn out or whatnot. Now, of course, any form of dynamics or dynamic feeling, like a vitality dynamic, has a content. So it could be an emotion, or it could be a thought. So for instance, let's take emotions, because people confuse, I think, what I mean by vitality dynamics with emotions. Let's take anger. You can have an explosive anger. You can have an anger that wells up slowly. You can have a cold anger. You can have a sneaky anger that sneaks up. In other words, the form, the vitality form and dynamic that the anger takes could be a whole variety of different forms, but it tells you so much of what's going on. You take something simple, like when you walked into the class in the morning and said hello, and you smiled. Now, let's talk about the smile in terms of the vitality dynamics. When somebody smiles, all that you really care about, everybody knows that a smile is a way of saying hello, greeting, and all that stuff. So that the actual explicit content of a smile is relatively boring and conventional. Everything is how you do it. So, if you meet somebody on the street, let's say, and you both greet each other, and you smile and you say hello or whatever, what happens is each of you expects a certain extent of display, which would really be the vitality dynamic of how they do it. So if you haven't seen them for a long time and you have a pretty close relationship, you expect that when they say hello and give you the greeting smile, the greeting smile is a characteristic thing that all humans do pretty much, at least in the West, and that is you raise your head up and you throw your eyebrows up and you open your mouth and you go, hi, like that, hi. Then you lower it back down. It gets more complicated than that, but that's the basic thing. Now, if you see somebody and they expect you to go, hi, and you go, hi, they'll say, well, did something happen here that I don't know about? Or if you expect them to only say hi, and they say hi, like that, and you say, what's going on? What do they want from me? Or what's, you know, so that, in fact, Ekman and Friesen, who study the facial expression, can tell whether somebody has an authentic or an inauthentic smile by the vitality dynamics of their face. If you're going to lie with your smile, it'll either have too slow or too fast a rise time. It'll be held either too short or too long, and usually its cutoff is more rapid. And so you can categorize them into authentic smiles and inauthentic smiles, whether you're using all of the muscles of your face or not, just the timing of this. Because remember, it's the force times the time that gives you the vitality dynamic of the thing. So you walk into the class and you say, good morning, everyone. Now, there are 100 ways to say that. And if the teacher has not either usually or on that day gotten themselves ready to say, good morning, everybody, and mean it, then everybody knows, oh, okay, here we go into another boring morning. Whereas if they do greet, that starts to set the relationship context differently. So here we come back to this business of how you modulate the relationship in the immediate context. The reason that you apply a force to these vitality dynamics is that you know that there is something like a will or an intention behind whatever you do. We assume that. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. It doesn't matter. We assume it. And that's what provides the force. And then you simply have to distribute it in time. And that's what gives you the experience of a dynamic event. I put a lot of importance on the dynamic events because, for me, they're what make it feel like to yourself that you are vital and alive. It is the way you move in time and space and with your force that is constantly giving you the impression of being a living organism. If you didn't have this, we would be like a software program. This is what makes the difference between being an analogic creature or a digital creature. I have no idea what a digital organism would be like, but it would be somebody that does not have vitality dynamics. I come back to passion. If you're passionate about your subject, this will become apparent in your vitality dynamics. And so they become one of the most important parts of our communicative set that goes into this Gestalt of what it is that you mean to say when you're trying to say something. Now, the reason we haven't talked in all these years about vitality dynamics or the dynamics of experience is because, one, we confuse it with emotion, which it is not. Two, we confuse it with sensation, which it is not. It is a separate thing that's very hard to grasp, and one of the reasons it's so hard to grasp is like that old business of the fish would be the last person to discover water. We live in our dynamic and our vitality dynamics. They are everywhere in everything we do if we experience ourselves and are experienced as alive people. They are hidden in full view, and so we don't see them. Yet they are key to so much of our subjective experience of other people's communications and our own. It's an interesting question. Actually, I'd love to hear Stein talk about it, as to whether people who have perhaps compromised mirror neurons like autistic children, how much they experience the dynamic experiences the way normal people do. There's some evidence that autists don't do it as much, which may be part of why they have difficulty reading other people's minds. They can get what an act is for, and they can get an idea of your intention of why you do it, even though it's harder for them to read. But they seem not to get the way in which you did it. Now, the way is everything. Let's take a dancer. Here we got a duet, a love duet on the scene in a ballet. And the two lovers do a beautiful little thing together, and then the girl goes off stage, can't see it, and the guy stays on stage and he does his thing, something like that. Now, the instructions in the dance is that she's supposed to enter on beat and run towards him, like to sort of have a getting back together again because they want to be back together. So she comes in on beat and she runs to him and they embrace, whatever they do. And looks okay, but it's a little boring. So what does the choreographer do? He says, don't go in on the beat. Wait a half a beat so you're behind. And then catch up the beat as you get to him. So now she has to be a little bit ahead of the beat progressively in order to get to him on time. When she does that, the audience feels the unbelievable excitement of the power of her desire to be with him, which she wouldn't have felt otherwise. This is playing with the vitality dynamics of the movement so that you know what's going on inside of her mind. You know what the meaning of her action is, which got clearer by virtue of teasing the vitality dynamics of the situation. So for me, this is a vital piece of business. Just a quick aside, for those of you who are interested in the arts, especially music, dance, cinema, it is all about the dynamic forms of experience. The idea is for the composer, choreographer, filmmaker, whoever, to move our arousal systems from moment to moment so that we feel the force in time in order to accomplish something that's wanted and to get across what's wanted and the feeling behind it and the intention behind it. And this is the basic unit, really, of most of the arts put together. You look at something like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which everybody knows, you know, the da-da-da-da. Anyway, he sets the theme up, and then, when you're not looking and don't expect it the next time, he goes da-da-da-da, and you get an arousal jag, and you go with it, and then he calms you down a little bit, And then he takes the ta-ta-ta-ta and he weaves it into the other music, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. He goes on fiddling around with it like that, and then all of a sudden, he hits you again with it. But now it's a little bit different because it's another instrument. Okay? This is a master class in shifting the vitality dynamics of something that's known so that you stay awake and enjoy it and have your nervous system played with. And this is what a good teacher should do. He teaches you what dynamics are about. He teaches you how to stay with it. And this is what all of the art forms ultimately end up doing. Let me go back now to this business of implicit knowing, of why it was adequate to say hello instead of saying whatever. I posed this question to me in terms of, this really has to do with the importance of the nonverbal in the relationship and in the communication. Why is it so important, and why do I give it sort of a primary position compared to the verbal meaning of what's being said? Babies don't start to talk until they're about 18 months. That's when they really start to understand. Why did nature make it that babies don't talk until they're 18 months or 2 years? What the devil is going on all that time if they're not learning about the world and stuff? What's going on is they are learning the basic infrastructure of interacting with other people. All of the basic rules of being in an interpersonal or group situation are what gets learned. What does it consist of? The whole infrastructure, which is things like, what do you do with your eyes when you're with somebody else? Are you allowed to look at them in the eyes? For how long? If you're going to turn away your head because it's too much stimulation or you don't like it, how do you turn away your head? Do you just go a little bit? If they don't respond, you go like this. Do you put your eyes down? Or to put them on hold and not completely stop them, you have to put your head up, which people take as a signal of cool it, but I'll come back to it. You know, what is the orientation of the shoulders relative to the other person that's permissible? How close do you accept being and still feel comfortable? And with whom and under what circumstances? What positions can you take? How do you go about making friends? How do you go about soliciting something that you want, like a hug or a cookie or something like that? What are the rules involved? How do you handle a prohibition against something that you want to do? How are you going to negotiate all of that? In other words, the better part of life is getting learned. I mean, the infrastructure of all this stuff has to be learned before you can add words to it. If you had words when you were trying to learn this, it would be a mess. Because all of the nonverbals are analogic. They go from across the whole spectrum, and words have a tendency to categorize. And you can't categorize these things. You don't categorize, well, how far away you're going to turn your head into units. You can if you're the scientist trying to figure it out, but not in real life. That's not what you do. You take it in one sweep. So this is what gets laid down first, and this ties back into the business of the primacy of movement, because most of this is movement, and it's where these things start. It is, as I say, why you can say hello. It's funny the way the marked moments so often, certainly in psychotherapy, have to do with these movements. Here's a story of a therapist who was very formal, and whenever the patient would come in, each session he would always shake hands, say hello, and then the guy would go to the chair. And then at the end of the session, he'd shake hands, goodbye, see you next Tuesday, whatever. Now, this one session, the patient told a really remarkable story full of grief and anger and totally turned around and shooken up on himself, and he'd been crying and all that stuff. And it was going to go on because it was a bad situation. At the end of the session, the therapist said goodbye, as usual. But this time, he took his left hand and put it on the patient's hand while he was shaking hands. Now, that then becomes a statement about the relationship and about what was said that changes the whole thing. Because now it is known that this was intersubjectively shared between the two of them. The sharing was validated by the act, and the therapy will be largely changed. For those of you who've been in therapy, you'll know that frequently the things that you remember 5-10 years after you've quit therapy, and let's say it was a reasonably good one, are not so much the interpretations and the words said to you, but some of these unusual acts that crept into the therapy, like the hands going like that, the time she leaned and said hello. Because in fact, a year after the hello, the patient said in passing, they never told her, she said, you know, remember that time I sat up and you said hello? I think beginning then I understood that you were open to me and on my side. That's what it meant, and that changed everything. See, we have to do it another way around. I know in a lot of the teaching examples that I've had, if the teacher can do something that is an act with you, put it into movement in some form or another, either in the way they talk about it or what they actually do, it has a different impact and it can stay longer. I remember I had a professor of obstetrics once, and he was trying to explain the anatomy of the uterus and the fallopian tubes and the cervix and all that stuff. And he got into a whole discussion about it, which was basically really boring and didn't. So finally, out of frustration, he said, listen, I'm a uterus. These are the fallopian tubes, and I'm surrounding the ovaries, and this is the body, and that's the cervix. That's all he did. Well, I've never forgotten. And I know what it supposedly looks like, at least in a gross kind of way. But that's what I mean. Things like that, they're really very, very helpful. Where am I here? So the implicit aspect of things is really crucial. Now, when I say implicit, most of us learned, or maybe you're too young, but I certainly learned that what implicit meant was procedural knowledge, how to ride bicycles and suck your thumb, etc. Turns out it's vastly richer than that. It includes emotions, it includes expectations, it includes mental models of what's going to happen, because you have these kinesthetic models which are never put into words. So it becomes a really major issue. And we know that, that this is a very big part of what we learn about the world. I think that it also, when you think about it with the primacy of movement, it makes you aware of other people's communications to you in a deeper, sort of larger sense, because you're willing to watch what they do and how they go about expressing themselves, where the act of the expression becomes part of the message and not simply the words that tumble out, which may be lousy. So it becomes really quite important. Let me tell you a little story about what you can learn from just watching the implicit goings-on between, in this case, a mother and a baby. And then I'll say something about narration. This is a story of a 9-month-old. He's sitting on the floor with his mother. They're sort of facing each other on the floor like that. And there's a puzzle on the floor, and he picks up the, I guess you can see me enough. He picks up a piece of puzzle, and he starts to put it in his mouth, like this. And the mother takes her hand and stops him and says, "No, that's a leaf. It's not to eat." And the baby goes, "Ah." And then he starts to put it back in his mouth, and she said, "No, it's a leaf. You're not supposed to eat it." And he goes, "Ah." And then she said, "I said no." And he goes, "Ah." So they're each escalating a little bit with the vitality dynamic. It's getting stronger. Think of it as a crescendo in music, in a duet. They're each crescendoing. Okay? Now, after he goes, "Ah," she gets ticked off, and her face squinches down a little bit like that. She comes closer to him. Her voice tightens down. The melody leaves her voice. And she says, "Don't you yell at your mother." I said no. At that point, the kid goes, "Ah, ah." So he over-escalates her very strong message. And at that point, he's won, and she's going to give up the battle. The way she does it is she rocks back into her position. Her face relaxes, she has a slight smile on it, and her voice becomes soft, melodic, and a little bit seductive. But in order for him to pay for his victory, because now he can eat it, she makes him pay in self-esteem. She throws at him a disgust expression. So she says, "Does that taste good? It's only cardboard." Like this, okay? This goes on all the time. Now, I know this woman. She's been a patient subject for a long time, see her often. She comes from a rather macho subculture of New York, and this is essentially the way her mother and father would do business. If the man wanted something, he would have to escalate, and the woman would say no, essentially. And then he would have to escalate more. "I want another beer, I want sex," or whatever it is. And he'd have to escalate very high, and then she'd back down. She would concede, but then he would have to pay for it. She said, "You're such a baby, you're such a pain in the neck. Why do you just go on like that." And this is the way she and her brother did business, and this is the way she and her husband now do business. And what we're watching in this little escalation about the puzzle is she's teaching him how to be macho faced with a woman. She's teaching him a negotiating style, which in fact is cultural. No words. This is how you go about being with another person who is of a certain kind in a certain situation. It is a very complex business, and it hangs on at what point are you really authentic in the sense of, do you mean what you're saying or what you're apparently putting forward? So we get back to the vitality dynamics and the prosody and the voice and what constitutes the meaning of something. And you don't need words for it, although you can also substitute it all and do it in words, but never disincarnated words. They don't exist. That's only something written. If you're really talking, it never happens. Let me just say one more thing here about narration, which is important and was part of what was on our agenda for talking about. When you start to narrate your experiences, be they verbal or nonverbal or mixed, where you're getting the whole meaning gestalt, funny things could happen. Because remember, a narration is not supposed to be the truth. It is not meant to be true. It is meant to have what they call verisimilitude. It's meant to feel like the truth, but not necessarily to be the truth. So it can do whatever it wants to feel like that was the way you experienced it. You can change the times, you can change the order of times, you can fiddle around, you can have all kinds of different voices. But the idea is to get it the feeling of what it was like to experience something, not what it was actually like. And the reason they're so fascinating is because your identity, whatever that is, and it's complex and multiple, depends upon the story you tell yourself and you tell others about who you are and what's happened in your life. And we know it's very context dependent, and I think Stein will talk about this, yeah? Because as you are with different people, your identity shifts. I don't mean 180 degrees, I mean even 10 degrees, 5 degrees, 30 degrees, whatever. But also, when you tell a story about something that happened, you are creating the official historical version of who you are. And so these become very, very important things. Here's an example. This is an example from Denny Wolf, who studied a lot children's narrations, children in school. This is the story of, I think she was about 7. A little girl and a little boy, they're twins. And they go to school together, they're in the same class. And the boy, we'll call him Joey. Joey is more of a cut-up, you know, and the sister's the more responsible one. So the little girl comes home from school, and the mother says, typically, well, how was school today? Or what happened today at school? Which is an invitation to tell a narrative about what happened. And she said, oh, it was okay. So the mother, who was a very smart reader of meaning and intention, knew that that wasn't her usual response. Oh, it was okay. You know, she threw it away with her hand and she kept it a little bit, but with her head she tossed it off, etc. So the mother said something like, well, was it special? Did anything happen? And she says, yeah. So the mother then gives her a signal that she's interested. Otherwise, nothing would have come out of this. And the little girl says, well, something happened with Joey this morning. The mother says, oh, what happened? She said, well, when the teacher went out of the room, Joey went up to the blackboard and wrote something on the blackboard and then sat down. And then the teacher came back in, and the teacher said, who wrote on the blackboard? And after a short pause, Joey raised his hand and said, I did. And the teacher said, I'm very proud of you, Joey, that you admitted that. And so the mother said, so Joey was sort of a hero for admitting that. And the little girl says, yeah. And so the mother says, well, wasn't he? She says, yeah, I guess so. And so the mother is getting the meaning that there's something wrong with this narrative. It just is not the way the girl feels. So she said, well, what happened? And the girl tells a little bit more, that the teacher was very happy. Then there's a pause, and the girl looks unhappy, and the mother says, "Oh, what's going on?" You know. And finally, the girl said, "Oh no." Before that, the mother says, "Well, we'll tell Daddy tonight, when he comes home, that Joey was a real hero today at school." So you can imagine now this celebration at night, the day that Joey told the truth at school, and that will become part of his official history as a truth teller and as somebody who's brave and courageous and takes responsibilities for what he does, and everybody, you know, is pleased. But the mother persists, and the girl finally says, "You know, I hate to be in the same class with Joey. He is always doing something that either embarrasses me or upsets the whole thing, and I just would love to be in another class. Okay, he was a hero, but I don't like the way it happens. I don't like the way he attracts attention and gets all this attention to himself in a bad way. He can recuperate it and so on." She went on like that. So now the history is very different. The history of what happened. He wasn't a hero only, and he certainly wasn't a hero for his sister. So, in a way, the mother, by persisting, changed the family's history. Because it did not become a big deal at dinner. They said very simply in passing, "Joey, it's a good thing you told the teacher the truth." Finished. Nothing more about it. So you can see the way history is getting written all the time in the course of these tellings. Now, just one last thing about that. A group of us at City College in New York, it was a wonderful group of people with Jerry Bruner and Carol Feldman and John Doerr and people like that. And we spent a few years meeting infrequently, but still to study what turned out to be monologues of a very precocious 20-month-old girl. What would happen is the father would put her down to bed because the mother was pregnant, and so the father took over this job and say goodnight and sang a song, did the usual things. And then Emily, her name was alone. And she'd be talking to her father like I'm talking to you. And then as soon as the lights went out and she was alone, she would change her voice. And she would say, "Now, Emily," and she started to tell this monologue, trying to put into narrative form what happened to her during the day. It's almost like she was trying to grasp it, to put it into some kind of form that it would become her historical identity as of the day. So she would say things like, "Emily went to Baba's house Emily, we picked up Jimmy, and then we went to, we go to Baba's house. Maybe we went to Jimmy's house. No, Emily," and she would go through this long thing, trying all the pieces to get her narrative structure of who she was this day and what happened to her together. And it was a fascinating work. It took her minutes and minutes and minutes to say, "We picked up Jimmy and went to my grandmother's house, grandfather's house," something like that. But she was really trying to do it. And so you can see this push to put it all in some kind of narrative form, and the energy that went into it on her part. So that once it gets there, it kind of gets a little bit stuck. But as I want to reiterate, when you're talking spontaneously, what you tend to do is you talk spontaneously where you don't know what you're going to say, and where the meaning gets intuited by yourself and by the listener. And then for other stretches, you run into your narratives. And those you can tell pretty smooth without all of the effort in the unfolding process, because they're, so to speak, written in your mind. And so what you see is this combination of scripted material and unscripted material being folded out as you go ahead. Now, I think that one of the things that I wanted to convey here was not so much specific information, but maybe a kind of different sensibility as to what is really going on in the relationship and in the community. And then hopefully one starts to use it a little bit differently and listen a little bit differently in their daily life. But I can't tell you how to do that because I don't have the foggiest idea. So thank you.